It's a bit strange that Ableton Live's two main samplers, sampler and simpler, are kind of actually the same device. You can turn a sampler into a simpler or vice versa, but they don't have the same features. In fact, the more powerful and feature-rich sampler hasn't received any significant updates in years and lacks some crucial features that can be found in simpler. So let me explain what the purpose of each of them is and why most people don't actually need sampler for making music. Which, by the way, is good news for people who don't own Ableton Live Suite, as it's the only edition of Live that includes sampler, while simpler is included in every edition, even in Ableton Live Lite. So the first and most important difference is that unlike simpler, sampler can use multi-samples. Using the zone editor, you can load different samples on each key or range of keys, which makes for better sounding instruments as opposed to just loading a single note and pitching it up and down the keyboard. This is especially important for realistic acoustic instruments, which often have different samples for different velocities. Sampler also has much more extensive options for sample manipulation, a lot more modulation possibilities, where you can pretty much assign anything to modulate anything. Kind of like these old school samplers like the Akai S series or the EMU samplers, or even something like Contact, even though Contact is way more powerful with its scripting possibilities. But from what I've seen, only a small number of Ableton Live users actually use sampler in their day-to-day music making. You see, unless you're taking the time to create elaborate sampled instruments, simpler actually offers pretty much all the functionality you need for quick and dirty sample manipulation while you are making music. And working with it is much faster and easier than sampler. So I think this is the reason why Ableton have taken the time and resources to refine the user experience and feature set of simpler, while sampler hasn't received any significant updates in ages. It's mainly used by people who make presets. And I'm sure that if you have a different use case for it, you will let me know down in the comments. So this is probably the reason why the user interface of sampler still looks a bit archaic, and even though it's supposed to be simpler's bigger brother, it still lacks some really necessary and important features that we have in simpler. For example, the 3 different sample playback modes that simpler has. Classic, where it works like sampler for playing samples polyphonically with all the sound shaping controls that synths have. And this is the bread and butter of what samplers do. It's like a synth, but instead of oscillators, you have samples. The one-shot mode, where a sample is played all the way through monophonically, so it's primarily for drum hits or sampled phrases. And of course the slice mode, which makes chopping sampled loops fast and easy. So yes, sampler doesn't have a built-in chopping mode. Although, to be fair, you can use the slice to MIDI feature of the audio clips to slice audio clips to different zones in sampler, but it's still not as convenient as using simpler's slice mode. And another thing it lacks is simpler's awesome real-time time stretching. Basically, Ableton have taken their famous warping mode from the audio clips and added it to simpler, meaning that if you load loops that are well cropped into simpler, you can pitch them up and down and they will retain their tempo and will stay in sync with the beat. Also, simpler got an expanded view that separates the waveform and sample settings from the synthesizer controls, so you can see everything at once, which makes working with it even faster and easier, while sampler just doesn't have that. The only thing that you can pop out is the zone editor for setting up your multi-samples. So when I said that they're actually the same device, this is what I meant. You can right-click on Simpler's title bar and choose the option to turn Simpler into Sampler if you want to use some of Sampler's features. If you've used any features that are only available in Sampler, turning a Sampler instrument into a Simpler will put Simpler in multi-sample mode, where you don't have access to the sample settings and waveform. But the sampler features that you've used, for example, the multi-samples or the extensive modulation capabilities, will be retained when you turn the sampler into simpler. You will just no longer have control over them. So generally, I only use sampler in separate sound design sessions to create instruments for my Ableton Live packs, which you can, by the way, check out from the link in the video description. But when making music, I only use ready-made presets in sampler, and I actually mostly use simpler, which is probably my favorite sampler in general. It's just so quick, so easy to use, does everything I need, and it actually has some pretty neat tricks up its sleeve, which you can check out in this video up here. See you there.